Liberia has an unfortunate and messy history. Founded as a refuge for recently freed Americans, it was the second black majority republic in the world after Haiti, and one of two nations to survive the scramble for Africa. However, the nation would struggle in the face of European encroachment, unstable politics, including a coup in 1871, and poverty throughout the 19th century that continued throughout the 20th, resulting in two civil wars and one-party rule into the 1990s. However, it didn't have to be this way. Many have wondered about a United States of Africa, a power built on the liberation of black Americans. And this, of course, begs the question, what if Liberia was a superpower? Well, okay, more of a regional power, but that's how I've started all these videos before, and that's how I'm going to keep doing it. One can't really discuss Liberian history without talking about both the role of slavery in its story and specifically that of the United States. The idea of Liberia is tied to the American Colonization Society, which was exactly what it sounds like on the tin. This group, overwhelmingly white, believed that African Americans couldn't justly and viably be integrated into the US and its general institutions, very obviously a racist sentiment, and endorsed returning as many of them as possible to Africa. However, this was highly contentious and often disliked by actual black Americans who saw the US as their home. Something about being there for 400 years, just as much as the white population. As a result, between the society's founding in the 1810s and 1847, when Liberia declared independence, only 13,000 people were transferred to the colony. Bear in mind, in 1850, the US had 3.2 million slaves, not even including the free black people. While obviously slaves didn't exactly have a lot of opportunity to leave for the colony, 13,000 out of a population that large is a drop in the bucket. Even if the idea wasn't horrendously racist, the entire conceit of the society would never work at those numbers. And while there were obviously natives in the country beforehand, in fact only about 5% of Liberia is descended from the Amero-Liberians, they were often discriminated against by the colonizers who saw themselves as better for their Republican ideals, Christianity, and basically everything any group uses to justify their superiority. In addition, we want to maximize the population anyway, so that we can support their expansionism later. Now, I'll be honest here, I have no idea how to bolster that support. Maybe Kentucky and Tennessee abolish slavery on the state level while also trying to get rid of them, creating a disproportionate interest in the colonization. That would likely take a lot of state level shenanigans anyway, but still. For the sake of having something to go off of, by the time of independence, Liberia has about 23 to 25,000. A major jump in population, but still keeps the historic trend of most black people not wanting to leave the only country they've ever known. Also, according to this paper, a quantitative analysis of Liberian colonization from 1820 to 1843, with special reference to mortality, by Tom Schick, freedmen in the South were more interested in the project than their northern counterparts. To the surprise of, quite literally, no one. Anyway, according to that same paper, only about 32% of the colonists could read. In contrast, in 1870s America, the oldest I can find a number for, it's about 20% who can't read or write. Now, you could make the argument that after Nat Turner's rebellion in the 1830s, states began to punish teaching slaves to read and write, and this is true, but that shouldn't necessarily be as detrimental to the reading of freedmen a mere 10 years later. Now, given that the US wanted to dump the freedmen and be done with them, they weren't too fussed about building proper education channels, but if these are any indication of general literacy among freedmen in the US at the time, then we have a problem. In addition, only about 40% of the population in Liberia now is considered literate, so, yeah, we should probably fix that. So, for the sake of it, we'll say that the ACS sponsors enough primary schools that, at the very least, the majority of children are attending some form of education, which will create a more robust economy and political class in the long term. Hell, it might even become attractive to immigrants in its own merits. To be clear, Wikipedia does say that schools were built early on, but it also doesn't cite anything for that, and literacy in the country still isn't great, so something clearly went wrong with early education. Sticking closer to our timeline, let's talk about early Liberian politics. Now, it didn't take too long for two major parties to emerge, the Republicans and the true Whigs. And funnily enough, as far as I can tell, the shared use of Republican is completely coincidental. The US didn't recognize Liberian independence in full until 1862 during the Lincoln administration, though it didn't bother maintaining much colonial control over it. And the Liberian Republican Party was founded in 1848 rather than the RNC's 1856. Now, the true Whigs went on to effectively destroy the opposition for a century, despite never actually outlawing them, so information about their very early days is difficult to get my hands on. However, we do know a bit about their economic basis of power. On the True Whig Wikipedia page, it claims that the lighter-skinned and more Europeanized settlers tended toward the Republicans, while darker citizens, who were also colonizers here, liked the Whigs. However, the source they cite makes no mention of this color divide. However, Wikipedia does have pictures of every Liberian president, and you can literally see this trend. Now, I won't extrapolate that one-to-one with the voters, but it does give some credence to the idea. According to a 1992 paper entitled The Emergence of Autocracy in Liberia, the true Whigs were a merger between the darker-skinned upper planters and the dark-skinned faction, their words not mine, of the coastal merchants. Either way, they were the party of centralization, economic modernization, and Whiggishness. In contrast, the Republicans were supporters of more classical liberalism. As a result, when the first true Whig president, Edward James Roy, took out a major loan from Britain, this combined with constitutional disputes to prompt a coup in 1871, but again, the Whigs took back power from the 1880s to the 1990s. Regardless, I don't think I'm going to mess with this party system too much. The colorism in Liberian politics is an unfortunate but logical outgrowth of the American racism in its own politics. So getting rid of it would be odd. But with the two-term presidency, and apparently no term limit, I think we can push Roy into winning the 1855 election and becoming the second president of the country. With a little luck, his loan with Britain will be able to pass without the coup, keeping Liberian democracy a little more stable. We'll also say he avoids trying to amend the constitution to give himself a 4-year term. While I'll admit I think it would be beneficial, it and the loan were both part of deposing him, so for the sake of things, it's probably just not worth it right now. Regardless, this loan from Britain could legitimately do a lot of good, if it's used to fund education or agricultural modernization. It would also be useful if it was pushed into industrialization, but that's the trickiest path forward. See, Liberia has about fuck all in terms of coal and oil, meaning that powering its own industries will always be a challenge that leaves it reliant on the US, Britain, or France. However, it does have plenty of iron, which will be useful in giving it some leverage, especially against France, who is also lacking relative to Germany and Britain, especially after the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. As a result, I do think that Liberia can industrialize and create a strong iron and textile mill sector, but that it will take luck and a relatively educated populace. Thankfully, I make very liberal use of protagonist-centered logic, so they can have all the luck they need, and we already talked about their literacy and education. This also creates a more diverse economy, which is good because it means more Liberians will be able to afford imported goods. By the 1860s, the country's exports of coffee, rice, and grain weren't really cutting it, and a lot of goods were becoming too expensive. Here, I think that will be mitigated by earlier, successful mining operations, creating at least a bit of heavy industry. Now, as far as expansionism goes, Liberia does still have some problems. Firstly, Sierra Leone, a British colony right next door, is off the table because Liberia could not survive a war with Britain, and wouldn't be crazy enough to try. Though I do want to point out that relations would be tense, due to British merchants disregarding Liberian law. But either way, if Liberia is doing well from the 1840s to 1870s, it would likely be able to expand south into what's now the Côte d'Ivoire, depriving France of the colony. However, the real goal would be going inland, rather than more coastal pushes. After all, that is a much easier through line than the rest of West Africa. Now, this Liberian manifest destiny won't be easy either, given that, unlike Native Americans, disease is working against the colonizers more than for them, but with the additional population from earlier, as well as a more stable economy without the coup, I think we can push them somewhat inland and further south. Now, I should point out that the Liberians weren't a monolith regarding their attitude regarding colonialism into the continent. President James Paine of the Republican Party tried, somewhat unsuccessfully, to work with the indigenous of the country, and felt that they could be an important ally for the nation. Now, given that the percentage of Amero-Liberians is in the single digits, I think he's probably right, and that this would be a useful manpower driver. So I'm going to say that here he's more successful in convincing the Liberian government that it's worth the trouble, but I also think the dynamic will be similar to the US and black citizens. Maybe not that bad, but still. Integrating the native people will also put a greater strain on the education system and the logistics of the bureaucracy in the eastern portion of the country, but we do desperately need to secure the population. The closest I can get to an actual population in 1860 is from a group called Clio Infra, which gives the territory about 394,000 people in that year. And the vast majority of that region is in fact Native Africans, meaning that if the country is to bring any of that manpower to bear, it needs to work with the natives. Now, realistically, these groups will still be disadvantaged by the country, similar to Black Americans at the same time, but I think that the numbers will make it very hard to actually impose long-term, permanent disenfranchisement of these groups. Britain certainly disenfranchised a lot of Indians by simply not allowing elections in the Raj until 1920, but Liberia doesn't have this advantage, both due to the numbers and the fact that it doesn't have the most advanced and professionalized army in the world to keep autocratic reactionary order. Throughout the 1870s to 1880s, as ties with the US open up due to recognition, as well as trade with the European great powers, we'll say that Liberia becomes a major iron exporter. While the European empires don't necessarily need Liberia's outsourcing, they will still readily take it. This allows the country to develop a stronger industrial sector, even if reliant on Western coal, and from there they begin pushing further south than they've otherwise been able to up until now. As the natives of the country are increasingly integrated into the Liberian experiment, and literacy increases in the nation, the colorism of the Republican Party becomes a weight on their neck, and the party struggles to adapt for a few decades, creating an epoch of true Whig dominance similar to our timeline, though likely much more fragile. Eventually, the Republicans will make the necessary pivots or begin to fade from relevance, and if they collapse, then the new party will be forged on the lessons of their folly. As a result, the true weight control over the state does not last nearly as long as it did in our timeline, and elections become truly competitive again in the 1890s. Now, I do want to dabble in the state of the US. I don't really think that Reconstruction will be radicalized by the relative prosperity of Liberia. If anything, it will encourage white people to support the deportation and colonization idea, since they have proof of concept that Americanized black people can prosper when removed from Anglo society. However, I really don't think that many African Americans would be convinced of the idea. After all, Liberia was doing okay in the 1850s in real life, and there was still a steady decline of immigrants to the country. I could see a scenario where the success of Liberia galvanizes white opposition, both from Northerners who think that deporting the freedmen is a good idea, and from the South who resent the end of slavery, which could cause greater political violence against the freedmen and a subsequent reprisal, but Johnson is unlikely to cave to that pressure. Which means that if anything, he comes down even harder on the freedmen. Hell, I could see forced deportation of the instigators to Liberia if he doesn't think he could get away with killing them. The actual amount of people Liberia gains from this is probably minimal if we're being honest here, but it is worth considering. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know that you guys like this kind of content. Thank you, and let's get right back to the show. Now, as we approach the scramble for Africa, things get interesting. Liberia wasn't invited to the Berlin Conference, no African nation was, but in our timeline they were already a relatively impoverished, minor state that had failed to keep up with the West, and were at best considered part of the American sphere of influence. In this world, however, Liberia is a much more modernized, Western-style country that has begun to partake in some level of colonialism to its south and east. It also has claims on British territory, but I cannot stress enough how unlikely that is to come to pass. Either way, I think it's fair to say that they could be invited to the conference, but obviously they probably have the least amount of diplomatic weight of any attendee. While they're recognized as independent of the American sphere of influence, I think that leaves them vulnerable to the other great powers trying to force their way into the region. Regardless, for the sake of the scenario actually being interesting, we'll say that Liberia is able to assert claims further inland into the Sahel. This likely alienates France, who needs that land to link up their Algerian province and their colonies on the southern coast of West Africa, but, well, France already isn't having a great decade anyway. This would just be the cherry on top. Now, as the 1900s approach, things are going to get very messy for Liberia. Let's look at where it's expanding into. Ivory Coast, Guinea, Ghana, and possibly even Mali. Do you know what every single one of these countries has in common in the year 1900? They each have over 1 million people, with Mali and Ghana eclipsing 2 million. Now, obviously the borders of Liberia mean that it's unlikely they're taking in the entirety of these populations, but it is going to make the ruling minority of Americanized Liberians even smaller and more unstable. Again, while Liberia took a more conciliatory approach to the natives than it did historically, and especially compared to the US or other Western colonial powers, it's still an oppressive minority ruling over a very diverse native majority. The Liberian Republic will likely hold, since at the least it likely can't get as bad as the American South, let alone South Africa, but this will be a potentially dangerous undercurrent of Liberian politics for years. Before we get into World War I though, let's talk a bit about pan-Africanism, an anti-colonial struggle that emerged from the mind of Henry Sylvester Williams around 1900, based on the commonality of European oppression. You'll note that is rendered somewhat askew by Liberia's history of independence and the fact that the oppressed became the oppressor. However, the political class in the country were still interested in it, and Liberia was party to several mid-century international conferences on the subject. However, I think that Liberian expansionism and their own sense of being different would impact their role in the movement, but they'd likely still be very interested in it. However, as the Great War looms, the question of Liberia's role in the conflict does come up. Realistically, they'd likely stay the fuck out of the building power struggle and just try to play the Entente and Central Powers off of each other. However, there's a legitimate question as to whether Liberia has that luxury or not. While it's had very little conflict with Germany, it will still get sucked more and more into the Entente sphere of influence as time goes on due to its lack in coal reserves and demographic challenges. However, this would be detested by the common people of Liberia, who rightly see themselves as being exploited by a foreign power, unless it can begin buddying up to Germany in secret, buying up a large stockpile of coal, one of the few resources that Germany has the initial advantage in compared to the Entente, and signs a secret alliance with them, promising Liberia much of West Africa, including Sierra Leone, if it aids Germany in a war against Britain and France. Okay, so I'll be upfront with you guys, this is incredibly implausible, largely because I think this would be suicide for Liberia to try. Even in the best case scenario I could get for them, they just don't have the right kind of resources to be a strong competitor against the West. But frankly, saying their best case scenario is an above average income nation in West Africa with a healthy democracy, while awesome for the people who actually live there, does not make engaging content. As a result, we're going to have Liberia make the gamble of its life and align with the Central Powers against the primary enemies in the Entente. Their primary goal is to get as much of West Africa as possible, either as territories or as post-colonial client states. Come 1914 and the invasion of Belgium, Liberia demands that Britain hand over the disputed border strip of Sierra Leone and are promptly shot down. Thus, they begin the invasion. Now, Liberia is legitimately more industrialized than the immediate ballpark, and they do likely have a bit of momentum in the early days. Because, seriously, even if Britain intelligence did catch wind of the Libero-German alliance, it would be such a low priority as to be negligible. Sure, they don't love the idea of having to turn over their colonies and hardworking, loyal British citizens, but come on. It's not even the lucrative part of Africa. As a result, the conquest of Sierra Leone encounters token resistance before the colonial governor capitulates, and Liberia turns its sight on Ghana and mobilizes men to help Germany defend Togo. This creates a problem for Nigeria, which is now in a two-front war. Is what I would say if it didn't already have 18 million people and completely outnumber everyone, even accounting for the fact that some of those resources would be in Europe and Nigeria was apparently getting involved in the conquest of German East Africa. I don't think Liberia is going to be able to break a country that has, at minimum, 3 times the population and is directly a part of the British Empire, especially because they are very much under blockade by the Royal Navy and are thousands of miles from the nearest country even sympathetic to their plight in the Ottoman Empire, who would also still have to cross hostile Egypt to do anything. However, having Nigeria rule over the country would also be boring. As a result, we'll say that with some alternative German planning and the fact that Liberia does have several million people in this timeline, West Africa also settles into trench warfare. It's likely more mobile than the Western Front, perhaps being comparable to the Eastern Front between Russia, Germany, and Austria, but still. Generally speaking, it's hell on earth, and time is on Nigeria's side. Liberia lacks coal and oil to power its cities, its food supply is hamstrung by the lack of trade with the rest of the world, and it is easily the weakest link in the Central Powers, while also being the one Germany can enforce the least, and the one least important for Germany to support. As a result, the soldiers grumble, with morale lower than Monrovia had hoped for. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, months into over a year of brutality and trench warfare, combined with highly mobile campaigns and harsh terrain with poor logistics on both sides. However, the Nigerian soldiers are neglected by the British Empire, and there's little for them to do but leap over the trenches into hell when the white soldiers tell them to, creating resentment there as well. The world watches Africa with bated breath, even if it doesn't know for what purpose. Then, Russia breaks, and socialism begins to take over the empire. Entente forces begin withdrawing from the minor fronts to go stabilize the region, including West Africa. Nigeria breaks under the neglect turned sabotage, and Liberia marches in. They propose moderate terms to the west, seizing Sierra Leone and any land they occupy in France, while establishing a client state in western Nigeria. Britain and France panicked at the Russian Civil War and German advances elsewhere, except allowing Monrovia to leave Germany to its fate. But that's not the end of the line for Liberia. Labor agitation will be an old problem for them at this point, but now with the rising power of the Bolsheviks and their subsequent win, these agitators become much more pronounced, coalescing into a proper political party that challenges Liberian capitalism and the establishment. Inspired by pan-africanism, they denounce the nationalism of the true Whig and Republican diarchy, but their numbers are still small. At least until the Great Depression. The West no longer buying causes a freakout in Liberia, and their exports collapse. And with them, the employment. With either a coup or crackdown post-election victory, the SPL rapidly assumes control over Liberia, transforming it into a more authoritarian form of socialism, inspired by the Soviet Union. They break the dominance of the Amero-Liberian colonizers and political machines, pursuing rapid industrialization, all the while likely moving several traditionally agricultural communities into the cities. They quickly begin espousing the liberation of the continent from British and French tyranny and pursue close ties to the Soviets. With the collapse of the French government, the country invades much of French West Africa to prevent it from falling into fascist hands. They create a series of client states arguing for pan-African ideals. Denounced by the British and Germans alike, tensions between them and the Allies remain high, especially with the establishment of Free France, with de Gaulle refusing to accept any French losses. However, with the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, Liberia declares war on Germany in solidarity with their own Russian benefactor, and de Gaulle finds himself forced down by the country. Post-war, Liberia is a close ally of the Soviets, hostile to the West. As the British and French empires decline, Liberia becomes a key player in the Soviet strategy to control the continent. While their standards of living are truly impressive for the region, and it is one of the most industrialized parts of Africa, it continues to struggle with resources and relies on aid from the Soviets. However, the future of Africa and that of the Cold War is uncertain. After all, the Sino-Soviet split will have serious consequences for the socialist world. And ultimately, I don't think that Liberia alone prevents the fall of the Soviets, meaning that their future in a post-1990s world is uncertain as well. As a result, I think I'm going to have to end the video here. Liberia is truly a titan of Africa in this world, having become one of the most industrialized and modern economies on the continent, having flanked the French and expanded further than they ever could in real life, and won a hard-fought victory in the First World War. However, the minority rule of the Americanized elite collided with the Great Depression and rising ideals of socialism and pan-Africanism, ultimately breaking the establishment, leading to the rise of an authoritarian, pro-Soviet dictatorship in the 1920s, and a crucial role in the African front of the Cold War. Before we go, thank you to channel members Salvatore Maggiolone, Daikami, Nebula, Japdeep Gill, Nafumato, and Grimwalt. And an extra thank you to Grimwalt for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you guys for watching, and join me next time to explore another alternate world.